my name is Alyssa Pengra, and I am here to present Module 7 for EDL856. Our assignment for this module was to create an internal-external communication chart for our school. In my case, I've got a couple of schools, but they're both elementary schools, so I went with Indian Valley Elementary. I felt like this chart would be the same whether I used this elementary school or a different one. One thing I would point out is that I do feel like this chart would look differently if I had done this from the district level. I think there'd be a couple more subgroups and some different forms of communication that would be used, but how I understood the assignment and how I was thinking about it was just from one particular elementary school and kind of, what would be their communication process and who they would be communicating with and what tools they would be using. As far as the program that I used to develop the chart, I used Lucidchart. And that was really, I picked that because it was the one that I was familiar with. I've had one other assignment where we had to create a chart, and in kind of playing with a couple of the different options, I found Lucidchart to be a little bit easier. So since I was familiar with that one, just from having used it once before, I went ahead and used it on this assignment as well. Although I found it to be easier than maybe some of the other options, definitely I wouldn't call it easy overall. And that's probably just because I have not done this a lot, so I'm just not very quick and efficient with kind of maneuvering the different tool options. In some respects, I found it easy to use, but some aspects of how you use Lucidchart definitely I didn't feel like were very user-friendly. I had a lot of problems actually with the arrows and getting them to do and go where I wanted. And then some other pieces I just had to play with for quite a bit of time to get it to kind of attempting to look like what I envisioned. The other aspect of this assignment that I felt was difficult for me was just before even, using the program to actually create the chart was just trying to visualize in my own mind what this would look like and what was the best way to visualize this information that I wanted to share. So that it's not kind of my natural way of thinking. I'm better with just writing it out. So that took me a little bit to even just try to envision and sketch out a couple of different versions of what it would look like and what made sense to me. So this is what I came up with. And then as far as just kind of walking through the chart a little bit, we have the two main groups of internal and external. And again, just thinking of this in my case for Indian Valley Elementary specifically, I felt like it made the most sense to just sort of have three internal groups of building level staff, students, and then communication that we would have with our district office staff and maybe the school board. I thought about breaking up the building level staff into a couple of different groups, maybe certified versus classified staff, but I didn't do that because when I really thought about the modality of communication that we'd be using, I felt like they'd be the same. So I just kind of kept that as one big group of just building level staff. And then on the external groups, parent guardians, families of our students being one group, and then businesses, civic organizations and groups in another. And then I kept it pretty broad with that last category of having taxpayers, prospective employees, and just sort of maybe the general public and kind of the Kansas City metro area that maybe aren't actually the taxpayer base, but it's just sort of in the metro area. And then, for most of these groups, you can see, I guess about half the groups, you have oral, digital, and written communication forms. And when you kind of look at that, you can see that's building level staff, students, and then parents, guardians, family groups have the most forms of communication, and then within those, the different types of communication. And I think that just speaks to, if you were doing a hierarchy of what groups are most important for communication, especially the frequency of communication, those would definitely be the top three groups. You're going to be communicating on a much more frequent basis with your internal building level staff and your students and your families as compared to, the district office level staff or outside organizations and businesses or kind of, that taxpayer base. So I think that that's very representative of the level of communication. And and kind of what groups are maybe the most important to have that frequent communication with. You can see just by looking at the chart, we have kind of a highly developed, we have a lot more digital options for our parents and families than maybe the general public and other groups with, email, social media, texting. We have a BV mobile app where parents and families can get information. There's a parent component to Canvas. We do written communication as well with flyers and handouts going home, that type of thing. And then, of course, meetings, whether that's, one-on-one meeting or phone call in person or otherwise, or parent-teacher conferences. So lots of that type of thing happening on a regular basis. So as far as strengths go, I don't know if I would look at it necessarily from a framework of strengths and weaknesses in communication with different groups. I just look at it as some are more developed than others, but that's out of necessity and out of kind of what's appropriate or what's an appropriate level of communication for each group. So, it might look like we have less communication with, prospective employees or general public or taxpayer base, which we do. I don't know if that's necessarily a weakness or, again, just a reflection of we obviously need to have a lot higher degree of communication with our families than with the general public on a regular basis. So some other things, I'll kind of scroll down here to some information I wrote up at the bottom. But with building level and district level staff, I would say that email is probably the most important form of communication. Though definitely at the building level, a lot of information is shared face-to-face as well in meetings. And I would say a common theme with a lot of these is kind of follow-up information. So for example, maybe information was shared face-to-face in a meeting, but that might be followed with an email about that meeting with some bullet points for anyone who wasn't there, but even for people that were there as kind of a secondary reinforcement of that communication. And the same thing happens with students. So a lot of the main communication is just going to come orally through the teacher within the classroom, and that kind of being the primary, but then the secondary coming through handouts that are sent home or digital communication through Canvas. I would say almost all communication we have, there's always a backup. So if something was communicated via email, it might have also been sent home. Or if you got the information orally, you probably also are going to get an email about it in most cases. I think when you look at more of the external public, that's where the school's website and our use of social media definitely becomes much more important. I wouldn't say that's a primary use or means of communication with internal groups, but it's a very important one for external groups. Digital is very important with our families. Most forms of digital communication, I think, lend themselves well to two-way communication, particularly social media platforms, email, and texting. And kind of thinking about the two-way communication, I think it's important for all groups. And kind of the way that I would interpret it, though, is just it's not necessarily important with the same frequency. So, for example, students, staff, and parents are going to very frequently require that two-way communication in order for the communication to be successful. Whereas, taxpayers, businesses, those are going to be more often consumers of the information and communication, but not always really needing to respond to the information provided. So a lot of it might just be the school kind of letting those external groups know what's going on, but it's not always in a situation where they necessarily need a response. Now, of course, sometimes there are, and there might be a survey that goes out or that type of thing, but it's just not as important as it is for building level staff and students and parents to be able to have that strong two-way communication. As far as a kind of a critique of my chart, like I said, this is definitely not my strength area of being able to visualize and create a flow chart. I didn't feel like there was a good way for me to visually represent all of the two-way communication that happens and how each group talks to each other. I felt like if I did that, it would just look like a bunch of arrows going all over the place and wouldn't really help with, clarity of the chart and how intuitive it was. So I just kind of left that off and just wanted to talk about that piece. I felt like the kind of the cleaner way to represent was just the different groups and what forms of communication that each one used. And then kind of the other question for our assignment was, how does our chart show that within the two publics groups that there is support for student learning and success? And I would say, looking at the chart, I wouldn't say that's something you would maybe pick up directly, but kind of indirectly in thinking about it, seeing all these different groups and all the different communication that is happening, I would think just with knowing that, that's going to equate to at least being the foundation for student learning and success, seeing that there's a lot of different groups and they're interested and they're involved and they're informed. And so just knowing that, I feel like you can look at that and see that most likely that's at the very least going to be setting that foundation for that student learning and success. So it's more of kind of showing that indirectly than maybe directly, but that would be my interpretation of kind of how you would see that. So that concludes my presentation of this chart, and hopefully you learned a little bit more about at least how I view communication at Indian Valley Elementary. Thank you for listening.